I was sipping my morning coffee when the sharp clatter of a jackhammer shattered the suburban silence. My first thought was that someone must be doing construction work way too early, but as I rushed to my front window I saw something that made my blood freeze. There was Karen, the notorious president of our HOA, standing in my driveway, wearing safety goggles and work gloves, operating a jackhammer like she owned the place, which in her twisted mind she probably thought she did. The jackhammer bit into the concrete with vicious precision, sending chunks of my driveway flying in all directions. I threw open my front door and shouted over the noise, but Karen didn't even look up. She was too focused on her destructive mission. Then it happened. A loud, menacing hiss cut through the air, followed by the unmistakable, sickening smell of natural gas. Karen finally stopped, her face going pale as she realized what she'd done. For months, Karen had been waging a petty war against me over what she called driveway violations. It started when she noticed that my concrete was a slightly different shade of gray than the rest of the neighborhood. According to Karen, this was a serious breach of community standards that threatened property values and neighborhood harmony. She'd left multiple warning notices tucked under my windshield wipers, each one more aggressive than the last. The first notice was almost polite, mentioning that she'd noticed my driveway appeared to be non-compliant with the architectural guidelines. The second notice was more formal, referencing specific sections of the HOA covenant and demanding immediate remediation. By the third notice, Karen's true personality was shining through. She'd written in bold red ink that my failure to comply was affecting the entire neighborhood's aesthetic integrity and property values. Karen had also started showing up at my door at increasingly inconvenient times. She'd ring the bell during dinner, during my work calls, and even once at 6:30 in the morning on a Saturday. Each visit followed the same pattern. She'd stand on my porch with her clipboard and manila folder, lecturing me about community responsibility and the importance of maintaining standards. She spoke with the authority of someone who genuinely believed she was saving the neighborhood from chaos. What made Karen's crusade particularly absurd was that my driveway had been installed by the previous homeowner 3 years before I even moved in. The concrete contractor had apparently used a slightly different mix, resulting in the minor color variation that had become Karen's obsession. I'd explained this to her multiple times, even showing her the previous owner's construction receipts, but she insisted that ignorance of the violation didn't excuse non-compliance. The notices escalated from polite reminders to stern warnings, and finally to outright threats. Karen had actually written in her last letter that she might need to take matters into her own hands if I didn't address the issue immediately. She'd also mentioned that she'd been researching the HOA's enforcement powers and had discovered some interesting options for dealing with non-compliant homeowners. I'd laughed it off, thinking no reasonable person would actually follow through on such an absurd threat. After all, we were talking about a driveway that was maybe 2 shades darker than the prescribed neighborhood standard, but I'd underestimated just how far Karen's need for control would push her. Karen had somehow convinced herself that as HOA president she had the authority to fix problems on private property. She'd hired a handyman and told him she was acting on behalf of the homeowners association to correct a code violation. The poor guy probably thought he was doing legitimate work. When I confronted her in my driveway, she waved a folder of papers in my face and declared that she was operating under community codes and architectural guidelines. I tried to explain to her that she had no legal right to destroy my property, but Karen was in full authoritarian mode. She pulled out what appeared to be a heavily highlighted copy of the HOA covenant and started reading sections aloud about architectural compliance and enforcement procedures. Her voice had that condescending tone she used at board meetings, the one that made it clear she believed everyone else was too simple to understand the complexities of neighborhood governance. The handyman she'd hired looked increasingly uncomfortable as our argument escalated. I could see him glancing between Karen and me, probably wondering if he was about to get caught up in some kind of legal nightmare. When I told him he was committing property destruction, he started to put down the jackhammer, but Karen immediately stepped in and assured him that she had full authority to Proceed. She even showed him what she claimed was a work order signed by the HOA board, though I seriously doubted its authenticity. Karen's confidence was unshakable even in the face of obvious legal problems. She kept insisting that property owners who violated community standards forfeited certain rights and that the HOA had broad enforcement powers to maintain neighborhood integrity. She'd clearly done some research, or at least convinced herself she had, because she was throwing around legal-sounding terms and citing specific subsections of documents that may or may not have existed. The noise had drawn a crowd of neighbors who gathered at the edge of my property, watching in stunned silence as this suburban drama unfolded. Some were recording with their phones, others were whispering among themselves. Everyone knew Karen's reputation for being difficult, but this was beyond anything we'd ever seen. She was literally jackhammering someone's private property without permission and acting like it was perfectly normal. Then came the turning point that changed everything. With one particularly forceful strike, Karen's jackhammer punched through the concrete and struck something that definitely wasn't supposed to be hit. The loud hiss that followed was unmistakable. She'd ruptured an underground gas line. The strong odor of natural gas immediately began filling the air, and even Karen, in all her stubborn determination, couldn't ignore the magnitude of what she'd done. I watched her face transform from confident authority to pure horror as she realized the danger she'd created. She dropped the jackhammer and stepped back, her safety goggles fogging up as panic set in. I was already pulling out my phone, dialing 911 as fast as my fingers could move. The neighbors who had been watching from a safe distance were now backing away even further, and some were already heading toward their cars. The first responders arrived with impressive speed, but the scene they encountered was chaos. Fire trucks, police cars, and hazmat units converged on our quiet suburban street like something out of a disaster movie. The fire chief immediately began cordoning off the entire block, ordering everyone to evacuate their homes as a safety precaution. The gas leak was serious enough that they couldn't take any chances with potential ignition sources. Within minutes, our peaceful neighborhood had transformed into an emergency zone. Yellow caution tape stretched across intersections, and emergency vehicles lined both sides of the street. The fire department's gas detection equipment was beeping continuously, confirming that the leak was significant and potentially dangerous. Neighbors were grabbing essential items and loading into their cars, many of them shooting angry glances in Karen's direction as they evacuated their homes. The gas company's emergency response team arrived shortly after the fire department, bringing specialized equipment to locate and stop the leak. They immediately identified that Karen's jackhammer had severed a main distribution line that supplied natural gas to half the neighborhood. The rupture was significant enough that they estimated it would take at least 6 hours to complete the repairs and make the area safe for residents to return. Karen stood in the middle of all this chaos, still clutching her folder of HOA documents, but her earlier confidence had completely evaporated. She kept trying to explain to anyone who would listen that she was just trying to maintain community standards, but her words were drowned out by the noise of emergency equipment and the angry voices of displaced neighbors. The reality of what she'd done was finally sinking in, and her face had gone from defiant to terrified. Karen, who just minutes earlier had been wielding power like a neighborhood dictator, was now standing in the middle of a full-scale emergency response that she had single-handedly caused. The authorities quickly traced the gas leak to her unauthorized jackhammering operation. Multiple neighbors were pointing in her direction, and the evidence was literally right there in my destroyed driveway. Her moment of absolute power had turned into her moment of absolute accountability. When the police began questioning witnesses, Karen tried desperately to spin the story in her favor. She claimed she was acting within her HOA authority to maintain community standards. She insisted that she'd followed proper procedures and that the gas line shouldn't have been where it was, but her explanations fell flat when faced with a mountain of evidence against her. Multiple neighbors had recorded her illegal destruction of my property, and the video footage clearly showed her operating heavy machinery without permits, without my permission, and without any regard for safety protocols. The lead detective wasn't buying Karen's story for a second. He dealt with enough HOA disputes to know that board presidents don't have the authority to destroy private property with jackhammers. When Karen tried to show him her folder of documents, he pointed out that none of them were actual legal permits or work orders from the city. Her so-called HOA enforcement powers were completely fabricated, and everyone present could see that she'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. Several neighbors came forward as witnesses, and their testimony painted a clear picture of Karen's escalating harassment campaign against me. Mrs. Johnson from across the street testified that she'd seen Karen measuring my driveway with a tape measure multiple times over the past month. Mr. Rodriguez from next door confirmed that Karen had asked him questions about property lines and whether he thought my driveway was an eyesore that affected his property value. The handyman Karen had hired was also questioned, and his testimony was particularly damaging. He admitted that Karen had told him she was the HOA president and had full authority to proceed with the work, but when pressed by investigators, he revealed that he'd had doubts about the legitimacy of the job from the beginning. Karen had paid him in cash and insisted they start work early in the morning before anyone else was awake, which should have been red flags that something wasn't right. The charges came swift and severe. Karen was arrested for property destruction, reckless endangerment, and multiple violations of city safety codes. As the police led her away in handcuffs, the evacuated neighbors watched from behind the safety perimeter. The woman who had terrorized the neighborhood with her petty power trips was now facing real consequences for her actions. The same neighbors who had cowed before her HOA authority were now glaring at her with unified outrage and disbelief. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Karen was fined $50,000 and immediately banned from holding any future HOA leadership positions. But that wasn't the end of her legal troubles. The gas company filed a separate lawsuit against her for the cost of the emergency response and repairs, which totaled another $35,000. The city also hit her with additional fines for operating heavy machinery without permits and for creating a public safety hazard that required the evacuation of an entire city block. The HOA board held an emergency meeting within a week of the incident, and Karen was unanimously voted out of her position as president. The board also voted to distance themselves from her actions by issuing a formal statement that she had acted completely outside of her authority and that the HOA would not be covering any of her legal expenses or fines. Several board members resigned in the aftermath, citing embarrassment over the occasion's connection to such reckless behavior. Karen's professional life also took a hit when her employer, a local real estate company, learned about the incident through news coverage. They immediately suspended her pending a review, citing concerns about her judgment and decision-making abilities. Having an employee who destroys private property with construction equipment isn't exactly the kind of publicity a real estate company wants. Within 2 weeks, they terminated her employment, stating that her actions were incompatible with their professional standards and client trust requirements. The city imposed strict new regulations on HOA authority, ensuring that no board member could ever again claim the right to destroy private property. My driveway was repaired at the HOA's expense,